January 1945. A layer of frost silvered the steel rails outside the camp near Temple, Texas. In the gray half-light, a dozen German prisoners of war stood beside a line of American boxcars, steam ghosting from their mouths. The guards spoke little. The only sound was the rhythmic hiss of a compressor, the heartbeat of something they didn't yet understand. Ludwig Berger pulled his thin jacket tighter as he watched two men open the door of one of the cars. A burst of white air rolled out, cold so sharp it burned. Inside, blocks of ice glittered against stacks of wooden crates labeled Florida oranges. The air smelled clean, sweet, impossibly fresh. For a moment, Ludwig thought of his home in Bavaria, where winter meant scarcity, not abundance. Cold was a punishment, not a tool. Yet here it was, contained, mechanical, harnessed to carry summer across states. The foreman motioned for them to help. The Germans passed crates hand to hand, sliding them along the platform into the humming car. The floor was slick with meltwater. Somewhere within the machine's hidden core, a motor drummed steadily, holding an invisible temperature. Ludwig glanced at a guard, who grinned and said, "Keeps the fruit fresh all the way to Chicago." He didn't reply. How could he? The idea seemed absurd. A train that carried not soldiers or ammunition, but oranges preserved by cold air. In the Reich, even the officers had rationed butter by the gram. Here, America was shipping luxury by the ton. When the last crate was loaded, the door clanged shut, sealing the cold inside. The sound echoed down the tracks like a closing vault. Ludwig watched his reflection in the metal surface, thin, hollow-eyed, his breath fogging against the polished steel. The hum continued, steady as the pulse of the new world that held him captive. That night, in the barracks, he couldn't sleep. The image of the refrigerated car lingered, the cold that preserved life instead of destroying it. It was the first time he wondered whether defeat might teach more than victory ever could. The context begins within the quiet order of America's wartime abundance. By 1944, America's prisoner of war system had become a continent-spanning network of fences, barracks, and labor details. Nearly 425,000 German soldiers, men captured in North Africa, Italy, and later France, were shipped across the Atlantic in Liberty ships and distributed to camps in 46 states. Each camp bore the same architecture of discipline: low wooden huts, wire perimeters, watchtowers rising over scrub grass and dirt. But what set the American system apart was not its confinement, it was its pragmatism. Prisoners were expected to work, not in munitions, but in agriculture, forestry, and the industries that kept the Homefront supplied. Texas alone hosted over 70 major POW camps scattered along the veins of the Southern Rail network. The one near Temple was typical, orderly, utilitarian, yet unexpectedly humane. Rows of tar-papered barracks stood beside a mess hall where cornbread replaced rye, and the guards, mostly older reservists, followed the Geneva Conventions with meticulous pride. According to War Department records, many prisoners there were assigned to nearby farms or rail depots. Work crews helped pick cotton, pack produce, and repair siding, tasks designed to sustain morale while contributing to wartime labor shortages. It was here that Ludwig Berger's world began to expand beyond the fence. Before his capture, he had been a farmhand near Augsburg, accustomed to hand plowing and seasonal scarcity. In Germany, food was precious, rationed by decree and scarcity. But in Texas, even during war, he saw abundance moving in motion. fields green under January sun, herds fat with grain, trucks rolling past with crates of fruit that smelled of summer. The contrast was bewildering. Behind this plenty was one of America's least romantic but most vital weapons, the refrigerated rail car, or reefer. These steel-bodied, ice-cooled carriers transformed the nation's food supply chain long before the war. But it was the 1940s that turned them into silent engines of endurance. Inside their insulated walls, perishables could travel thousands of miles, from citrus groves in Florida to markets in Chicago, from beef packing plants in Kansas to army canteens on the East Coast, without spoiling. A 1943 War Food Administration bulletin recorded that the United States operated over 200,000 refrigerated rail cars, each maintained through a precisely timed choreography of ice depots and maintenance crews. At every terminal, great mounds of harvested ice, carved from frozen lakes or manufactured in vast cooling plants, waited to be loaded into roof bunkers. The process was mechanical yet elegant. Cold air descended, cycling through vents, keeping temperatures near freezing even under southern heat. When German prisoners were assigned to assist with agricultural shipments, few grasped the technological web surrounding them. They saw only the crates, the wagons, the wooden pallets slick with meltwater. Yet through those details, the American philosophy of war revealed itself. This was not a nation starving for victory. It was a nation feeding its people and its soldiers alike, confident that efficiency itself could be a moral virtue. Letters preserved in the National Archives Camp Correspondence Collection show glimpses of astonishment. One anonymous prisoner wrote in careful script, "We loaded fruit that had traveled 2,000 kilometers. It was still fresh. The Americans say they can send milk in trains without it spoiling." Such things are beyond belief. Even guards were aware of the irony. They used to look at those cars like church bells, one Texas depot worker recalled in a 1978 interview for the Southwest Historical Quarterly. Couldn't believe the noise meant something cold inside. To them, cold was winter and hunger. To us, cold meant plenty. Through the winter of 1945, Ludwig watched those trains come and go, each one an emblem of ordered power. The smell of oranges, the glint of ice, the rhythm of locomotives heading north, all of it formed a kind of education. As the war dragged toward its end, America's use of its prisoners evolved from labor to education. The War Department, guided by the Office of the Provost Marshal General and a little-known initiative called the Prisoner of War Special Projects Division, believed that exposure could reform ideology more effectively than punishment. Inside these fences, the United States conducted a quiet social experiment, re-educating men through what it called controlled contact with democratic efficiency. At first, this meant classes, English lessons, civics films, and lectures translated from pamphlets with titles like The Machinery of Freedom or The Citizen's Responsibility. But soon, the officials realized that nothing lectured more eloquently than the physical world around them. To see American systems working, to witness abundance, fairness, and industrial rhythm was, they hoped, to plant the seed of doubt in fascist soil. In 1944, the War Department's Circular 1945 introduced observation assignments, where selected prisoners could visit or work in industries considered emblematic of American prosperity. These were not factories of war, but of life: printing presses, canneries, farms, and food processing plants. The logic was precise. Let them see how a democracy feeds itself. By that winter, a handful of German prisoners from camps in Texas and Arkansas were permitted to assist in the loading and unloading of refrigerated freight. They were issued temporary passes, always under guard, and observed the synchronized ballet of America's cold chain. The Railway Ice Company of Dallas kept logs noting foreign labor assistance under Army supervision. In these ledgers, Ludwig's name appears twice. Berger, Ludwig, supervised loading, citrus shipment, 14 January 1945. The work was mundane, yet transformative. At dawn, the men stood beside rail cars lined with galvanized steel. They heard the hiss as massive blocks of ice slid into the bunkers through rooftop hatches, filling the air with the sting of frozen vapor. American foremen, pragmatic and unguarded, explained how each car had to be re-iced every 250 miles, how thermometers in the vents kept the temperature steady. "You could move summer from Florida to Michigan," one man said, not realizing how such casual mastery sounded to foreign ears. For Ludwig, the experience dismantled something internal. He had been taught that America was crude, decadent, undisciplined. Yet what he saw here was order, an industrial elegance that mirrored the precision Germany once claimed as its own. And unlike the machinery of war, this system existed to preserve, not destroy. Letters intercepted and translated by U.S. censors reveal this subtle transformation spreading across camp populations. One POW wrote to his wife in Würzburg, "They have trains that carry meat colder than winter. Even in the desert, their butter does not melt. They do not fear hunger." Another, less guarded, added, "If this is democracy, then it runs on engines more perfect than our slogans." Not all prisoners were impressed. Some saw arrogance in such abundance, believing that a nation so insulated from deprivation could never understand sacrifice. But others, like Ludwig, found their certainties cracking. The cold that seeped from the cars no longer felt sterile. It felt alive, disciplined, almost moral in its refusal to waste. By spring, the War Department noted in an internal memorandum that productive exposure has generated constructive conversation among educated prisoners. The re-education program expanded. Chaplains introduced discussions about stewardship and progress. The guards noticed fewer outbursts, fewer escape attempts. The rhythm of life around the rail yards, the locomotives, the ice houses, the endless movement of perishable cargo became a quiet teacher. For Ludwig, each passing day deepened the sense that captivity was becoming something else, a vantage point from which he could see both the folly and the potential of human ambition. The refrigerated rail cars no longer symbolized foreign excess. They were emblems of possibility. And as he lifted the final crate of that season, hearing the hatch close over another shipment of frost and fruit, he wondered whether he would ever again see a system so dedicated to preservation. The descent begins when that wonder turns inward, when Ludwig's awe at America's abundance collides with memories of the hunger that once shaped him. By late February 1945, the frost began to thin across the Texas plains, leaving behind a muddy thaw that mirrored the unease inside Ludwig's mind. Each morning, the whistle of distant trains reached the camp like a call to another world, one of motion, commerce, and purpose. Within the wire, the rhythm was slower. Men swept the barracks, patched uniforms, and lined up for roll call, their unease dulled by sameness. But Ludwig carried something new inside him, a quiet obsession with the rail cars he had seen. At first, the memory was simple: ice, oranges, the hum of refrigeration. But as days passed, the image became symbolic, even haunting. He couldn't stop picturing the sealed compartments gliding northward, their interiors colder than winter, yet filled with life. The paradox pressed on him. Why did this cold preserve while the cold of Europe destroyed? In the trenches of Russia, he'd watched frost turn men into statues. Here, that same frost delivered nourishment. It was as if America had inverted the laws of nature. He found himself studying everything related to food. During kitchen duty, he noted the deliveries. Milk arriving in chilled cans, butter wrapped in waxed paper, vegetables stored in coolers made of insulated tin. Once, a guard named Miller caught him staring too long at a bin of apples. "Go ahead," the American said, tossing one toward him. "We got plenty." The fruit was crisp, cold to the touch. Ludwig bit into it cautiously. The flavor shocked him, not for its sweetness, but for its absence of decay. It was the taste of preservation. That night, he wrote a line in the small notebook prisoners used for English exercises. "Cold is not death." He underlined it twice. Then, as if ashamed of his own revelation, he tore the page out and burned it in the stove. But the idea lingered. Word spread among the camp's prisoners about America's cold trains. Some mocked the fascination. "You're bewitched by machines," one former sergeant told him. "They drown you in comfort, so you forget who you are." Yet others listened in silence, perhaps sensing that Ludwig was touching something deeper, a vision of power that didn't depend on conquest. When work details resumed, he watched for the trains again. The sound of metal coupling, the hiss of pressure valves, the deep groan of locomotives starting their run, it all seemed choreographed. The guards hardly noticed the beauty of it. To them, these were just supply lines, but to Ludwig, they became symbols of a nation whose strength was invisible yet everywhere, pulsing beneath the ordinary. On Sundays, he joined the camp's voluntary discussions, sessions led by a soft-spoken American chaplain who quoted scripture about stewardship and renewal. "To preserve," the chaplain said one morning, "is an act of faith. To keep life from spoiling, even when the world is burning, is moral work." Ludwig listened, wondering if the man understood how perfectly those words fit the gleaming steel cars outside the fence. One afternoon, while helping at the depot again, Ludwig brushed his hand against the side of a loaded refrigerator car. The metal was cold enough to sting. Inside, fruit rested under carefully balanced ice. He thought of the children in bombed German towns, picking through rubble for scraps, and felt an ache he could not name. He wasn't angry, he was bewildered. How could two worlds exist on the same planet, one where cold meant starvation, the other where cold meant preservation? That night, he dreamt of walking inside one of the cars. The air was blue with frost. Crates gleamed like altars, each marked with painted letters: California, Florida, Idaho. He reached out and felt the chills seep into his skin, clean and merciful. When he woke, his hands were trembling. The descent had begun, not through violence or deprivation, but through recognition, the realization that abundance itself could be terrifying. By March, the nights grew warmer, but inside Ludwig's mind, the cold deepened. He began to see the refrigerated cars not merely as machines, but as metaphors for a civilization that had mastered preservation, of food, of comfort, even of ideals. Yet that mastery unsettled him. Each time he thought of Germany's cities burning under Allied raids, the contrast was unbearable. America's cold chain moved food while his homeland's railways moved refugees and corpses. Both depended on steel, both required discipline, but one sustained life and the other consumed it. In the camp library, a converted supply shed, with dog-eared English manuals, he found a magazine left by an American technician, Popular Mechanics, April 1944. On its cover, a man smiled beside a gleaming train car under the headline, "Keeping America Fresh." The article described how dry ice could maintain temperatures for a 1,000-mile journey. Ludwig traced the diagrams with his finger, studying how vents circulated the air, how thermometers controlled expansion. It read like poetry disguised as engineering. For the first time, he admired something American, not as a conqueror's trophy, but as an intellectual triumph, a symphony of human effort in service of life. He tried to share the discovery with others. "It's not just machines," he told a fellow prisoner named Kruger. "It's how they think, how they refuse waste." But Kruger only shook his head. And what good did it do? They destroy cities with the same precision. The words stung. Yet Ludwig couldn't deny their truth. Perhaps preservation and destruction were twin reflections of the same genius. Some nights the prisoners were allowed to listen to the camp's radio, tuned carefully to the armed forces network. They heard reports of Germany's collapse, of bridges falling, of the Reich in retreat. As the news grew worse, Ludwig found himself fixating not on the defeats, but on what must follow. When the war ended, how would his country feed itself? How would it rebuild when even the soil was exhausted? The refrigerated cars offered a kind of answer, a vision of post-war possibility. He began sketching crude designs in his notebook. Insulated containers, portable ice bunkers, even hand-cranked chillers for small farms. It was absurd. He was a prisoner, not an engineer, but the act steadied him. For the first time, he was thinking about creation again. Then came a day that seared itself into memory. A derailment occurred a few miles down the track, a mechanical failure, nothing violent. A crew of Americans and POW laborers were sent to help clear the mess. As Ludwig approached, he saw the overturned car, its steel panels torn open. From the wreck spilled a flood of oranges, glistening in the sun, still cold to the touch. The scent was overwhelming, sweet, alive, defiant against the dust. He crouched and picked one up. It was perfect. A guard noticed and shrugged. "They'll be dumped anyway," he said. Ludwig looked at the mountain of wasted fruit and felt something twist in his chest. So much care, so much machinery devoted to saving this produce, and yet a single accident reduced it to ruin. He couldn't help thinking of cities, of people, of nations, all fragile in the same way. Preservation demanded vigilance, and the moment it failed, abundance turned to decay. That night, the dream returned, this time darker. The refrigerated car moved endlessly through fog, the hum of its engine steady as a heartbeat. Inside, the crates were empty. Only frost remained, whispering through vents like breath. He woke, drenched in sweat, the words repeating in his mind, "Cold preserves, but only if tended." In that paradox lay his descent, the slow unraveling of pride, replaced by something raw, humility. He no longer saw America as an enemy to be hated or a paradise to be envied, but as a mirror reflecting what humanity could build when it chose preservation over destruction. And when the first spring train roared past the camp, carrying the scent of citrus on its cold breath, Ludwig knew he had crossed an invisible line, from captive to witness. The routine begins with that witness settling into rhythm, as the strange machinery of preservation becomes the backdrop of his daily life. By April 1945, the war in Europe was nearly over, though news filtered into the camp slowly, like faint signals through static. The guards spoke less about battles now, more about harvests and shipments. For Ludwig and his fellow prisoners, the days unfolded in measured loops. Morning roll call, work detail, lunch of beans or cornbread, evening fatigue. Yet beneath that monotony, something quiet had shifted. The rhythm of captivity had synchronized with the rhythm of the railroad. Every morning at 7, the men could hear the distant engines start, a low, rising tremor that passed through the fences, the ground, even their ribs. When the wind blew from the south, it carried the faint smell of citrus and diesel oil. For Ludwig, those sounds became as familiar as church bells. He began to recognize the intervals, a double whistle for departure, a single long wail for arrivals. It was a music of order, of movement that hinted at a larger harmony beyond the wire. Work details now frequently brought him back to the depot. There he learned the small rituals that kept the cold chain alive. Workers would slide heavy blocks of ice down wooden chutes into roof hatches, then seal them with burlap and sawdust. Each action was practiced, efficient. The men joked about feeding the train its breakfast. Ludwig came to appreciate the precision of their labor, the care with which they balanced each load, tested each seal. It reminded him of tuning an instrument. One misstep, and the entire symphony could sour. He noticed, too, the humanity within the machinery. American workers treated the freight as more than cargo. They handled it like a promise. A foreman once told him, "Somewhere up north, a mother's waiting on this fruit for her kid's birthday. That's why we keep it cold." The words struck Ludwig harder than any propaganda. This wasn't greed, it was guardianship, a whole nation moving food so no one would go hungry. In the camp, meals improved modestly. Once a week, crates of vegetables arrived, fresh and firm, despite the journey. Ludwig couldn't help wondering if they came from the very trains he had helped load. He savored the taste differently now, as if each bite carried the hum of the rails. The others teased him for eating slowly. "You're acting like it's gold," one joked. "Maybe it is," he replied. At night, the barracks cooled quickly. The men huddled under thin blankets, their breath visible in the dim light. Some cursed the cold. Ludwig found comfort in it. The chill reminded him of the cars, of the hidden life preserved in silence. He began sketching again, drawing crude outlines of insulated walls and air vents in the margins of his notebook. He didn't know why, perhaps to remember, perhaps to build something different one day. Occasionally, American guards would linger near the fence, curious about their captives' reactions. "You folks sure like them trains," one said with a grin. Ludwig answered carefully in English, "They are beautiful machines." The guard laughed softly. "Guess they are. Never thought about it like that." It was a small exchange, but for Ludwig it felt enormous, a moment where the wire between them thinned, not in metal, but in understanding. Sundays brought chapel service and brief reprieve from labor. The chaplain often spoke of stewardship again, weaving faith into the notion of care. "To protect what sustains life," he said one morning, "is the highest work of the soul." The words echoed against the barrack walls long after the service ended. Ludwig carried them like a tool, something simple, useful, enduring. The weeks passed in quiet repetition, each train whistle marking time more faithfully than any calendar. The refrigerated cars came and went, indifferent yet dependable. In that constancy, Ludwig found a strange peace. For the first time since capture, he no longer counted the days to release. He simply lived them. By early summer, the Michigan air had thickened with heat, and the work grew heavier. The POWs now joined American crews, at sunrise, their breath steaming against the first light. Each morning, the sight was the same. Rows of white rail cars gleaming like silent sentinels, waiting for their next journey. Ludwig's hands had calloused from months of hauling ice and stacking crates, but there was pride now in the fatigue. His body, once used for destruction, had been folded into an economy of preservation. The guards began to trust the Germans more, and supervision loosened. At times, Ludwig was allowed to ride the empty cars a few miles down the line before they returned for cleaning. From that brief vantage, he could see fields unfolding endlessly, patchworks of green and gold stitched by the silver thread of track. The country seemed infinite. It humbled him, this realization that war had tried to wound something so vast and self-sustaining. He started keeping a small log in German, part technical manual, part diary. He described the refrigeration systems, the route times, even the behavioral quirks of the American foreman. But between those lines ran quieter thoughts. They do not fight the cold, they use it. They control it like music, measured, patient. Later, such words would puzzle his readers back home. But in that moment, they were the truest he could write. Camaraderie in the camp took on new rhythms too. At night, the men spoke less of the Reich and more of what they might build afterward. One dreamed of opening a bakery with cold storage bread trucks. Another wanted to design better rail brakes. Ludwig mostly listened, feeling both the ache of distance and the pull of possibility. He realized the Americans were teaching him without meaning to, not with lectures, but with example. Some evenings, he stayed awake, listening to the trains beyond the fence. The rhythmic clatter became almost liturgical, a metallic hymn, marking the passage between captivity and comprehension. Each whistle seemed to say, "There is another way to move through the world." In late July, a small but telling event occurred. A refrigerated car malfunctioned, spoiling an entire load of oranges. The American supervisor cursed under his breath, but instead of assigning blame, he gathered the POW crew. Together they examined the faulty valve, traced the frost lines, debated solutions. Ludwig suggested insulating the joint with layered cloth, soaked in brine. It worked. The foreman nodded and said, "Good thinking, Fritz." The name, once an insult, landed differently now, half jest, half respect. The next day, Ludwig saw something rare. An American flag reflected in a puddle beside the tracks. The colors rippled in the water, blurred by the breeze. For a moment, he thought of Germany, not in pride or bitterness, but in comparison. Nations, he realized, were like machines. Their purpose depended on how they were maintained, how heat and cold were balanced, how energy was directed toward life instead of ruin. Rumors of surrender reached them by August. The camp buzzed with a cautious quiet, each man unsure of his future. Yet amid the uncertainty, Ludwig found himself looking again toward the tracks, not for escape, but for meaning. He had come to see the refrigerated trains, not just as marvels of engineering, but as emblems of restraint. In a world built on destruction, these machines preserved. When orders came to prepare for repatriation, Ludwig walked the length of the yard one last time. He placed his hand on the cool metal of a departing car and listened to the compressor's hum. The vibration was steady, alive. He whispered to himself, "This is what endurance sounds like." The following morning, as the trucks arrived to transfer the POWs, the depot foreman raised a hand in farewell. Ludwig nodded in return, understanding something wordless had passed between them, something more durable than fences or flags. That night, from the moving truck, he watched the last line of refrigerated cars fade into the horizon. They seemed to breathe frost into the summer air, like ghosts of a different kind of power, one that preserved rather than destroyed. The turning point began when that realization finally took root inside him. By September 1945, as the Reich lay in ruins and surrender had silenced the front, Ludwig sat aboard a transport train bound for a processing camp in New Jersey. The war was officially over, but in his mind it was still unwinding, thread by thread. Through the small, barred window, he could see America speeding past, towns rebuilt, fields tended, bridges whole. For the first time since capture, he felt the full measure of what Germany had lost, not only territory, but the moral architecture that held men upright. The rhythmic clang of the wheels seemed to echo that truth. Every revolution, a quiet indictment of the machinery that had once driven him to war. He thought of the refrigerated rail cars again, their quiet, measured hum, and realized that their purpose had been the inverse of his own. Where he had been taught to destroy, they existed to preserve. The thought unsettled him. It was not America's victory that disturbed him most, but its restraint. In the camp at Fort Dix, the POWs awaited their final orders. They would soon board Liberty ships for Europe, where their repatriation would begin. Many were eager. Ludwig was not. He spent his days helping medical staff inventory supplies, cotton gauze, penicillin, saline bottles, all stacked in neat rows. One American nurse joked that he organized things like an engineer. He smiled faintly, though her words struck a deeper chord. He remembered his sketches of the refrigeration units, the systems he had traced by hand, and felt an urge stirring, a desire to build again, but differently this time. One afternoon, an American officer addressed the prisoners in halting German. He spoke of reconstruction and cooperation, of Europe's chance to rise from the ashes. His tone was pragmatic, not triumphant. "The world cannot live on hatred forever," he said. "We must learn to keep things from spoiling." The metaphor hung in the air. Ludwig wondered if the officer meant the trains or the world itself. Letters from home began to arrive. Most spoke of ruin. Cities leveled, families scattered, hunger gnawing at the edges of every day. Yet within those letters were traces of endurance too. A childhood friend wrote, "The Americans send food parcels. Their tins are miracles. We live from their cold cans." Ludwig folded the page carefully, realizing how deeply the cold chain he'd once helped maintain now looped back across the ocean to his own people. That night, in the dim light of the barracks, he opened his notebook again. He began sketching a new kind of train, one that could carry both food and medicine. In his design, each car was divided. One half refrigerated for produce, the other climate-controlled for medical goods. It was nothing more than pencil on paper, but the act itself felt redemptive, almost sacred. The hum of the trains he'd left behind still pulsed in his memory, steady as a heartbeat. As days lengthened into weeks, small details began to crystallize into something larger. Ludwig noticed how American logistics worked like invisible veins through the nation, how supplies reached hospitals, schools, and homes without interruption. It wasn't wealth alone that sustained it, he realized, but faith in the act of preservation. Theirs was a culture built not only on power, but on continuity. A chaplain visited often, speaking softly to the men who still carried anger or shame. He told them that redemption was not found in confession alone, but in what they built afterward. Ludwig listened closely. He began to see that his own transformation was not a sudden conversion, but a slow thaw, the melting of an old, rigid certainty. One evening, he stood at the edge of the camp's fence, watching the freight trains pass beyond the perimeter. The same sound that had once tormented him with longing now soothed him. Each passing whistle was like a benediction. He no longer imagined escape. He imagined return. Return not to a defeated Reich, but to a human purpose. The sea crossing home was long and quiet, the Atlantic an endless grey plain. The POW ship, once a Liberty vessel, had been stripped of its armaments, its decks loaded with men who stared eastward toward the wreckage of their homeland. Ludwig stood often near the rail, tracing condensation on the cold metal, feeling how the chill seeped through his hands. It reminded him again of the refrigerated cars, of the mechanical heartbeat that had sustained life across a continent untouched by ruin. America's power was not in its weapons, he thought, but in its temperature, in its balance, its calm efficiency, its refusal to decay. When they reached Le Havre, the devastation was staggering. The port was a forest of twisted steel, the air sharp with the smell of rust and salt. Allied workers guided them through ruins with practiced patience. "You'll find your way," one said, simply. Ludwig nodded, though he felt unmoored. From there, they were sent by train through the scarred French countryside. Rail lines patched, bridges replaced, the countryside littered with reminders of the war he had once helped to fight. The contrast was painful. The trains creaked and groaned, wagons cold and bare. There was no hum of preservation here, no steady rhythm of industry. The supply chain was fractured. The cold chain had frozen in its absence. Food spoiled before it reached the hungry. Medicines sat useless in warehouses without power. For the first time, Ludwig saw how fragile civilization truly was when deprived of care. By the time he reached his home, near Bremen, he found only outlines of what once was. His family's house had burned. The street was rubble. His younger brother had not survived the winter. And yet, amid the desolation, neighbors were rebuilding with salvaged wood, patching roofs with tar paper and hope. A British relief station nearby offered bread and powdered milk, supplies from America, still cold from insulated containers. Ludwig carried one can home in silence, turning it over in his hands like a relic. Weeks later, he began volunteering at that same relief depot. His mechanical training and his exposure to American logistics made him valuable. He repaired small refrigeration units, cleaned evaporator coils, and explained, using broken English and hand gestures, how airflow mattered more than ice. A British sergeant once remarked, "You Krauts sure learn quick when it's about keeping food from spoiling." Ludwig smiled faintly. He had stopped hearing insult in the word. One morning, a Red Cross representative visited, asking for skilled prisoners willing to assist in rebuilding cold storage facilities for hospitals. Ludwig signed his name without hesitation. The work was grueling but purposeful. He found meaning in every compressor he repaired, every valve he tightened. The hum of the machines became, once again, the sound of endurance. Months passed. The Allied staff rotated home. The camp dissolved. But Ludwig stayed, first as a civilian worker, then as a consultant for a fledgling German engineering firm that specialized in refrigeration technology. It was there, in a makeshift office amid the rubble, that he redrew his design for a dual-use refrigerated rail car. This time, he added one detail: a small emblem beneath the technical notes, a circle enclosing a pair of hands, not holding weapons, but offering sustenance. His colleagues asked where the idea had come from. He simply said, "From captivity." What he meant was something larger, that preservation had become, for him, a philosophy. The same discipline that had once sustained America's abundance could, if learned humbly, sustain Germany's recovery. By 1948, his designs caught the attention of a European relief consortium. His prototype would eventually become part of the food distribution network that stabilized post-war Germany, a quiet legacy born from the hum of a foreign machine. The transformation had taken years, not moments. Yet the seed had been planted the first time he heard an American train whistle through the wire, carrying cold air and quiet purpose. That understanding of power that preserves rather than destroys was what would carry him into the next chapter, when the boundaries of captivity dissolved completely and freedom demanded its own discipline. The collapse, escape, liberation begins when that freedom finally arrives. Spring 1948 arrived in a haze of dust and thaw. The first wildflowers pierced the rubble along Bremen's sidings, and trains once again rolled out of the depots, their cars glinting under cautious sunlight. Ludwig watched one of them depart, a new refrigerated unit, its steel panels smooth, its internal chill whispering faintly through the vents. It was his design, though his name did not appear anywhere on it. He didn't need it to. The hum itself was recognition enough. Freedom had come not as a single moment, but as an unspooling, gradual, deliberate, without ceremony. There were no guards now, no fences, no shouted orders. But there were still boundaries, ration cards, Allied permissions, political suspicion. Former POWs were watched closely, their loyalties measured in paperwork and patience. Ludwig understood the scrutiny. Freedom, he realized, was a form of responsibility, an agreement to preserve rather than consume. Work became his lifeline. He traveled by rail between Hamburg and Hanover, overseeing the repair of cold storage depots. Each site bore scars of the old world, bullet-pocked walls, rusted cranes, shattered windows. Yet inside those ruins, the compressors began to hum again, their rhythmic pulse echoing like the sound of recovery itself. On one journey, he shared a compartment with an American engineer attached to the Marshall Plan. The man spoke briskly, chain-smoking as he described the massive shipments of grain, milk, and medical supplies crossing the Atlantic each week. "We're not rebuilding Europe," he said. "We're keeping it from rotting until it can rebuild itself." Ludwig turned that phrase over in his mind. It was refrigeration as metaphor once more, the belief that preservation was an act of mercy. They stopped in Hanover, where a warehouse had been converted into a temporary storage hub for relief goods. Ludwig stepped inside and felt the air change, the sharp chill against his face, the faint metallic scent of ammonia, the same signature of the American cold chain he had first encountered in captivity. For a moment, the memory of Michigan returned so vividly he could almost hear the train whistles again. But this time, the cold did not symbolize confinement. It was liberty, disciplined, structured, and human. He moved among workers from Britain, France, Poland, even Germany, all laboring together to restore systems of sustenance. There was no ideology here, only function, and in that, a kind of peace. Outside the depot, children watched the trains with wide eyes. They had never seen abundance move so freely. Ludwig knelt beside one boy and explained in simple words, how cold could travel. It rides with the food, he said, like a shadow that keeps it safe. The boy frowned, then smiled. Like magic? Ludwig shook his head gently. No, like care. That evening, as he boarded the return train, Ludwig looked out over the rail yard. A low fog had gathered, glowing under the lamps, making each line of track appear endless. He realized then that liberation was not just release from walls, but entry into responsibility, to protect, to repair, to continue. He had escaped not from America, but from the blindness that had sent him to war in the first place. Back in Bremen, he found a letter waiting. It was from an American officer he'd met at Fort Dix 3 years earlier, the one who had spoken of keeping things from spoiling. The letter was brief, almost businesslike, but its tone was warm. I hear you're building something worthwhile. The world needs more men like you. We all rot without purpose. Ludwig read it twice, then tucked it into his coat pocket. It was proof that understanding could cross oceans. He returned to the rail yard the next morning and watched workers test one of the new refrigeration units. When the compressor roared to life, he smiled faintly. The hum was no longer foreign. It was familiar. His own pulse echoed back to him through steel and frost. By autumn 1948, Germany was changing faster than anyone could track. The old divisions between victor and vanquished were softening, replaced by the shared urgency of reconstruction. Ludwig had become one of many quiet bridges between those worlds, an engineer whose knowledge came not from textbooks, but from captivity. He now worked under contract for a European consortium that managed Allied relief logistics. His task was to oversee the calibration of refrigerated freight cars traveling between the port of Bremen and depots deep inland. The routes hummed with activity, each one carrying the cold breath of a continent relearning how to feed itself. When he rode alongside American technicians, the air filled with the low murmur of compressors and cigarette smoke, a rhythm that felt oddly comforting. On one of those rides, as the train curved through the Rhine Valley, Ludwig rested his head against the window. The reflection staring back at him was thinner, older, but the eyes carried a steadiness that had not existed before. He thought of the boy in Michigan who had handled oranges with reverence, of the foreman who had trusted him to fix a valve, of the American nurse who had called him engineer, each memory stitched into the next like rails across the land. At a refueling station, he stepped out onto the gravel and watched the men unload ice blocks from insulated trucks. The hiss of vapor as they slid into the cooling chutes reminded him of the breath of the earth itself. Life exhaled, then captured, then reused. The discipline of it all, the refusal to waste, was what bound them together. War had been the pursuit of destruction. This was the worship of preservation. But liberation also brought shadows. There were moments when Ludwig faced suspicion from his own countrymen, men who had not been taken prisoner and still viewed the Americans as occupiers. You learned from them, one sneered. You serve them now. Ludwig did not argue. He only said, I learned how not to starve. To him, that answer was not shame. It was wisdom. Late that year, while inspecting a refrigeration plant outside Hamburg, Ludwig found himself standing in a room full of humming machines. The sound was identical to that of the American cars. Yet something about it now belonged to him, to Germany, to everyone rebuilding from ashes. He closed his eyes and listened, not just to the motors, but to the echo beneath them. the faint rhythm of continuity restored. A British engineer beside him noticed. "You hear something?" he asked. "Yes," Ludwig said softly. "I hear it working." That night, he walked along the rail yard as snow began to fall. The tracks gleamed like silver arteries, feeding a nation back to health. The cold no longer signified emptiness. It was proof that life could be sustained, even in stillness. Liberation, he realized, was not about movement alone. It was about temperature, keeping the world from freezing over or burning out. When he returned home, his notebook lay open on the table, filled with sketches and notes written in both English and German. Across the final page, he wrote a single line: "Preservation is the truest form of strength." In the years that followed, Ludwig's designs would quietly influence the rebirth of Europe's cold transport system. He never sought fame. He sought function. And though he never again saw Michigan or the men who had shown him that silent world of refrigerated rails, their lessons remained in every hum of every machine he built. The war had once taught him that power lay in domination. America had shown him instead that power could lie in restraint, in keeping life cold enough to endure, warm enough to hope. And when the hum of his final design faded into the winter air, it did not sound like the end of captivity, nor even the end of war. It sounded like continuity, like mercy made mechanical. The aftermath begins when that quiet hum echoes into the next generation. By the mid-1950s, Europe had thawed into a fragile peace. Trains, once again, crossed borders that had been lines of blood only a decade before. The hum of refrigerated cars, now standardized across the continent, had become a symbol of post-war recovery. Beneath their cold exteriors flowed the pulse of a new world, one that valued preservation more than conquest. Ludwig Brenner, now 42, worked as a senior engineer for a transport firm headquartered in Hamburg. He was not wealthy, nor well-known, but his work mattered, and that was enough. Each morning, he arrived early to inspect the freight lines before dawn. The air smelled faintly of coal smoke and brine from the Elbe. He would touch the metal skin of a passing car, feeling the vibration within, the low tremor of compressors breathing life into perishable cargo. Sometimes, when the sun broke through the mist, he imagined the sound stretching across the Atlantic, linking him invisibly to those American yards where his transformation had begun. Germany had changed, though not entirely. Factories hummed again, cities glittered with electric light, but the memory of ruin still lingered beneath the surface. Ludwig lived quietly, refusing the nationalism that had once claimed his youth. In his home, a single relic of the war remained, a folded drawing, yellowed by time, showing his first sketch of a dual-compartment refrigerated railcar. He kept it pinned above his workbench as a reminder that understanding could grow even from captivity. Sometimes visitors from abroad came to tour the Hamburg depots. Among them were Americans, engineers from companies like General Motors and Frick. When they met Ludwig, they greeted him with professional warmth. One of them, a gray-haired man with a Detroit accent, once remarked, "You folks took what we started and made it your own. That's progress." Ludwig smiled faintly, though he felt something deeper than pride. It was gratitude, an unspoken acknowledgement that the line between captor and captive had dissolved into the shared rhythm of machines. He often thought of the phrase the chaplain had spoken years earlier in the Michigan camp: "To protect what sustains life is the highest work of the soul." The older he became, the truer it seemed. Each compressor, each insulated panel was a sermon in steel. Preservation had become his religion, and the hum of the cold chain its quiet hymn. At home, his wife Clara, whom he had met through post-war reconstruction work, understood this devotion. She called his trains the children he never stopped raising. Together, they lived modestly in a rebuilt apartment overlooking the harbor. Sometimes, at night, they would stand on the balcony as the refrigerated trains passed below, their headlights glowing faintly through the fog. "They sound alive," she would whisper. Ludwig would nod, listening. "They are," he'd reply. But the legacy of war was never far away. Former soldiers occasionally gathered at local cafes, trading stories colored by nostalgia and denial. Ludwig rarely joined them. When he did, he spoke little. One evening, a man boasted that Germany's engineers had always been superior. Ludwig looked at him evenly and said, "Then perhaps it's time we prove that with compassion, not conquest." The table fell silent. He left soon after, stepping into the cold night air. Outside, the distant hum of the trains carried the answer he needed. In 1958, the firm he worked for received a commission to design refrigerated transport units for the newly forming European Economic Community. Ludwig led the project quietly, integrating ideas drawn from both American and German systems. The blueprints bore traces of both worlds. Angular German precision, softened by the modular practicality of American design. When the first completed train rolled out of the yard, Ludwig stood among the crowd of workers, listening as the compressor started. The hum rose, steady and full, echoing through the steel like a living pulse. He closed his eyes and thought of the Michigan wind on that first day of labor, the frost on the orange crates, the foreman's calm voice. It was all still there, carried forward in sound and motion. The years rolled forward quietly, each marked by the steady rhythm of engines and schedules. By the 1960s, Ludwig Brenner's designs had spread far beyond Germany. His modular refrigeration systems were now used in depots from Rotterdam to Warsaw, each one an echo of the same principle: preservation through balance. Yet he never claimed ownership. "It belongs to the idea," he would say, tapping his chest. "Not to me." In 1963, an American delegation visited Hamburg again, part of a post-war cultural exchange between industrial engineers. Among them was a man in his 40s, the son of a Detroit rail worker. When introduced to Ludwig, he shook his hand firmly and said, "My father helped build the first cars you saw in Michigan." The words hung in the air. Ludwig felt the years collapse in that handshake, the long loop from prisoner to peer, from observation to creation. "Then tell him," Ludwig replied softly, "that his machines kept me alive." That evening, after the delegation had gone, Ludwig walked alone along the riverfront. The city lights shimmered on the water like scattered memories. He thought of all the fan who had shared his captivity, the ones who had never returned, and those who had returned unchanged. For them, he had tried to build something lasting. Each humming train, each cold car, crossing a border, was an unspoken act of remembrance. Preservation was no longer mechanical, it was moral. In his later years, Ludwig began writing, not memoirs, but reflections, short essays about work, duty, and the ethics of machinery. In one, found after his death, he wrote, "Machines remember what men forget. When they preserve, they forgive us. When they fail, they remind us of how easily warmth can vanish." He passed away in the winter of 1971, seated at his desk beside a small model train and a thermocouple still ticking faintly. Outside, A refrigerated freight convoy rolled through the night, its hum mingling with the sigh of the river wind. His wife Clara found him with a faint smile, as if listening to that sound one last time. In the years that followed, his colleagues continued his work, modernizing the cold chain across Europe and beyond. His name appeared occasionally in technical journals, but more often in the quiet acknowledgments of engineers who never met him. To them, Ludwig Brenner represented something rare, a man who had been broken by war and rebuilt himself through preservation. Today, one of his original rail cars remains on display at a logistics museum near Hamburg. Visitors walking its narrow corridor can still hear the faint vibration of its restored compressor, a steady hum, beneath the glass placard that bears a single inscription: "To preserve is to endure." That hum, the same one that had once drifted through Michigan nights, through fenced camps and frost-laden orchards, has never fully faded. It carries forward through time and distance, a living frequency connecting men who once faced each other as enemies, now bound by shared craft and care. If one listens closely, it sounds less like machinery and more like forgiveness made audible. And somewhere within that endless rhythm, Ludwig's story continues through every cold chain that keeps life moving, every quiet act that resists decay. If this story moved you, subscribe to POW Tales, where every silence of war finds its voice again.